Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Israel has agreed to limited breaks in fighting in Gaza as video emerges of 2 hostages still being held captive. A key moderate in the U.S. Senate says he won't seek re-election, what that means for both political parties. And actor Robert De Niro's production company is ordered to pay $1 million for how it treated a former female employee. I'm Sumi Somaskanda. It's good to have you with us. Israel's closest ally, the U.S., says there will be a daily 4-hour military pause in areas of northern Gaza to allow civilians to flee. President Biden said he pressed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the pause.
Did you ask him to pause for 3 days to get the hostages out for that
Yes.
length of time?
I've asked for even a longer pause for some of them.
But the Israel Defense Force says this doesn't amount to a ceasefire. These pauses are intended to allow in humanitarian aid and help civilians flee south along an evacuation route, escaping the intense bombardment of airstrikes in the north. The State Department said there will be 2 humanitarian corridors for people to flee. These drone shots show an endless stream of people leaving Gaza, most of them on foot, arriving at refugee camps in the south. Meanwhile, talks continue to free more than 240 hostages still being held in Gaza. The Palestinian group Islamic Jihad released a video of hostages it claims to hold. Stills from the video show Hana Katsir, a woman in her 70s. She is seen sitting in a wheelchair. The second hostage is Yagil Yaakov, a teenage boy. Both hostages sharply criticize Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but it is not clear if they're reading from a script. The Israeli army called the video, quote, psychological terrorism. For more on that, I spoke with our diplomatic editor, Paul Adams. Paul, at this point, what more do we know about the video and the hostages that were featured in this video?
So this is a video released not by Hamas, but by one of the other Palestinian factions in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a smaller group, which is thought to be holding a number of hostages itself. There were 2 in the video. They are Hana Katsir, a woman in her 70s who was abducted from kibbutz Nir Oz on October the 7th, and a 13-year-old boy, Yagil Yaakov. In the video, both of them speak, and both of them issue quite harsh criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister. Now, of course, we don't know if they were speaking their own words or reading some kind of script. And the Israelis, once again, have greeted the release of this video as a bit of psychological warfare by the Palestinian militants. But they've also recognized that, at least as far as those 2 hostages are concerned, it is a proof of life.
Indeed, and at the same time, Paul, we're seeing the reports that there will be 4-hour pauses daily to get aid into Gaza. What is Israel saying about how this is intended to alleviate some of the civilian suffering we've seen in Gaza?
It's not quite clear how it's going to work. I mean, the Israelis say, look, for the last few days, we've had these pauses which have allowed tens of thousands of civilians to move away from Gaza City, which is the focus of the fighting right now, down towards the south where they can find relative safety. No place in the Gaza Strip is safe, but it is certainly safer down there than it is in Gaza City. And so, in effect, there are pauses already in place. Now, whether they will have a slightly wider purpose in terms of access to humanitarian aid, we'll have to see. None of that aid is getting to the north. It's only really coming in to the south. Of course, and the other thing that people are hoping is that it might buy some space and time for some kind of hostage deal. But again, all of these things are very uncertain at the moment. But what it is certain is that those pauses are being used by tens of thousands of Palestinians to flee the fighting.
On the diplomatic front, our partner here in the U.S., CBS News, has been reporting that international mediators are closing in on a possible deal for a 3-day humanitarian ceasefire in exchange for the release of around a dozen hostages held by Hamas. And they are citing Egyptian officials, a UN official. What more do we know about this at this point?
Well, the Israelis have been saying for some time now, no ceasefire unless a significant number of hostages are released. We don't know what significant really means. But here are the various moving parts. We had a meeting in the capital of Qatar, Doha, between William Burns, the director of the CIA, the head of the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad, and Qatari officials, at which presumably the issue of hostages was very much front and center. Then we had news that 2 senior Hamas officials were in Egypt talking to the head of Egyptian intelligence. Again, presumably hostages would have been part of that discussion. And we're also hearing that the leader of Qatar, the Emir of Qatar, is flying to Egypt tomorrow. Now, would he be going there if there wasn't something that perhaps he wanted to announce? Well, we'll find out tomorrow. But I think what is absolutely clear is that a great deal of diplomatic effort is being put into this issue of trying to get hostages out of Gaza.
Meanwhile, amid the caravan of people fleeing to safety, there are growing concerns about the conflict spreading, drawing in countries like Yemen. Our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, reports.
More Palestinians left their homes, moving along Salah ad-Din Street, the road to southern Gaza, after Israel said they would not be attacked if they left the battle zone to the north. Pauses in Israeli combat operations were welcomed by the Americans. All this raises the ghosts of 1948 for Palestinians, when more than 700,000 of them fled or were expelled by Jewish troops as Israel won its independence. Israel never allowed them home. 2 of the Gaza hostages were in new videos. Hannah Katzir blamed Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, for their plight. So did Yagil Yaakov, who's 13. Hostage videos are usually made under duress, so the BBC is not broadcasting them. And across the West Bank, the other side of the occupied territories, more Palestinians were killed as armed groups fought Israeli raids. The Gaza war is igniting the West Bank. The Israeli army's reprisals included the destruction of roads and infrastructure. Existing tension and hatred have been deepened. The danger remains of the war spreading across the Middle East. In Yemen, the Houthi regime, an ally of Iran, posted more videos of attacks on Israel with missiles and drones. So far, they've all been intercepted by American and Israeli air defense systems. Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, a senior man in the regime, gave the BBC an interview from Yemen's capital, Sana'a. He said Islam legitimized attacks on Israel, which he called the entity. Do you think the war here in Gaza and Israel can spread elsewhere in the region?
If the Americans and the British and the French continue backing this entity or to participate in the war alongside this entity, this would be a normal response and result of the American and European attacks and movements.
There are people who say that you're attacking Israel because Iran told you to.
We, in Yemen, enjoy freedom and democracy more than the British people are given these days, Jeremy. The British people these days are unable to express themselves freely. The Secretary of State, i.e. Home Secretary, is calling to stop all demonstrations that back Palestine. Where is the freedom and the democracy that you enjoy in Britain?
Not a straight answer. They were digging through the ruins in Khan Yunis, part of the area of Gaza Israel has ordered civilians to get to. What is certain is the dispossession and loss suffered by Palestinians caught up in Israel's war to crush Hamas. They might have dreams of home. Many already know that Israel has turned their homes to rubble. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Southern Israel.
The Hamas-run health ministry says more than 10,000 people have died in Israeli attacks in Gaza since October 7th, when Hamas killed 1,400 Israelis and took more than 200 hostages. Israel's retaliatory assault has prompted hundreds of thousands of Gazan civilians to flee south, as we just saw. Our correspondent Rushdie Abu-Alouf met some of them in Khan Yunis, where an influx of displaced have arrived at a refugee camp.
Thousands of people arrived today, since the opening hour was a little bit bigger, from 9 o'clock until 4 o'clock. But this journey is really miserable for the people. I met a couple of them today who arrived to this camp here in Nasser Hospital. People were walking for about 3-4 kilometers because there is no access for cars or any sort of transportation. So the people have to walk. I saw a father who's carrying his son over his shoulder in the heat of the sun. Which it's unusual weather here in Gaza in November, and it's really about 30 degree in Gaza. But yes, people under the sun were walking, carrying their kids, some of their belongings if they can, and they made this journey into south. Why? Because the fighting in Gaza City is really intensified, taking very serious fight near the Al-Quds hospital in Gaza. It's a Tel El-Hawa area. It's a neighborhood in the southwest of Gaza. As the tanks advance very close to the hospital and people there, very few people remain in the area, and communication is really hard. But I was talking to someone who fled this morning, and he said it was a real gun battle in the area.
Earlier, I spoke about the Israel-Gaza war and the broader security situation in the Mideast with White House National Security Spokesman John Kirby. Admiral, we're seeing that there will be daily 4-hour pauses in fighting, but President Biden said today that he's asked for a pause in fighting, quote, longer than 3 days. Why are we seeing then these very limited timeframes?
Well, I think it's important to remember with these pauses, each one's going to be localized and specific for various purposes. And so we're constantly talking to our Israeli partners about the importance of humanitarian pauses, and each one will, depend on the purpose and on the conditions on the ground. So yes, we would like to see more pauses. We'd certainly like to see longer pauses to get aid in and get people out. We'll keep having that conversation with our Israeli partners.
So President Biden was asked if he was frustrated with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he said, quote, it's taken a little longer than I had hoped. What exactly is he then asking for from the Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, I think we've been talking to them, again, since the very beginning of this conflict about, A, making sure they've got what they need to go after Hamas, and we're continuing to provide security assistance, and also make sure that that we're urging them to conduct their operations in the most careful, deliberate, cautious way possible so that civilian casualties can be minimized. And a part of that, and that's why today's announcement is so important, is making sure that civilians can get out of harm's way.
Admiral, I want to ask you about hostages as well. Palestinian militants, as you know, have released videos of 2 hostages held in Gaza. And we've seen Israel saying this is an important sign of life. At the same time, we've seen CIA officials, Israeli Mossad chiefs meeting with the Qatari Prime Minister, as you know, to discuss the parameters of a deal for hostage releases. Is a deal then contingent upon a longer pause in fighting?
When you talk about securing the release of hostages, it's not just the deal to get them released. It's about getting them safe passage so that they can get to safety, get to the medical care, get to their families. And so in the context of getting hostages released, yes, you're going to have some pause in the fighting for at least a period of time, and hours, if not days, over a localized area, depending on where these hostages are. So certainly that's part of the discussions. But again, I want to be careful I don't negotiate too much in detail here.
So the U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Humanitarian Issues, David Satterfield, said the following: we do not believe that a conflict involving Lebanon and Israel is in any way inevitable. But the BBC interviewed the second in command of Hezbollah earlier this week, and he said this, quote, the danger is real because Israel is increasing its aggression against civilians and killing more women and children. Is it possible for this to continue and increase without bringing real danger to the region? I think not. What's your response to that?
We would agree with our special envoy. There's a big surprise, David Satterfield. Of course, we don't believe it's inevitable that this conflict should be widened or escalated. In fact, almost everything we've done in the early hours and since has been to try to prevent that outcome by adding additional force posture to the region, 2 carrier strike groups, additional air and missile defense, even fixed-wing fighter aircraft, to try to send a strong signal to anybody in the region, be it Iran or some other actor like Hezbollah, that this is not the time to try to take advantage of what's going on and escalate this conflict.
Admiral Kirby, very good to get your thoughts on BBC News today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Good to be with you.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's take a look now at some other stories. Britain's Home Secretary is facing questions about her future after defying Downing Street over an article accusing the police of bias. Suella Braverman claimed aggressive right-wing protesters were, quote, rightly met with a stern response, while pro-Palestinian mobs were largely ignored. The article was not cleared by the Prime Minister's office. Here's the BBC's Chris Mason.
So step away from politics and the Home Secretary and Downing Street spokesman and all that kind of stuff. Put it in your own world. If you went to work and you chose to undermine the boss, then you did undermine the boss, then you publicly humiliated the boss, would it leave your job security prospects enhanced or diminished?
A spokesperson for the Prime Minister said Downing Street is, quote, looking into what happened over the article, but they added Mr. Sunak had full confidence in the Home Secretary. Ms. Braverman is popular on the right of her party and seen as a possible future Conservative leader, and she often takes a harder line than many of her colleagues. You're watching BBC News. Senator Joe Manchin says he won't run for re-election. The Democrat from West Virginia has held a powerful spot in the Senate where Democrats have a very narrow majority. The news is another jolt in a week of political stories as the 2024 presidential campaign heats up. And let's talk about all of these stories now with my guest. With me here in the studio is Jonathan Cott, who served as Mr. Manchin's communications director from 2013 to 2020. He's now a partner at the lobbying firm Capital Counsel. And to my right in the screen is Nathan Gonzalez, editor of the website Inside Elections. Nathan, great to see you as well. I'm going to start with Jonathan here in the studio because, as we said, former communications director for Joe Manchin. Were you surprised at the news?
I wasn't surprised. I know he's been frustrated with the sort of political bickering and the partisanship in the Senate for years. It's a complaint he's had and something he's tried to fix, you know, I'd say since he got to the Senate. So I'm not surprised he did it. I was a little surprised he did it today, given how close he is to the filing deadline. But when Manchin makes a decision, he announces it to the world the second it's, you know, set in his mind.
Hold that thought. I'm going to ask you about the timing, but I want to get Nathan's thoughts on this as well. What do you think, Nathan?
Well, if Manchin had run for re-election, I think Democrats were probably still going to lose the seat. Now that he's not running for re-election, Republicans are definitely going to win the seat. I mean, Manchin has an impressive track record of winning over decades in West Virginia, but the state has simply been running to the right, running toward Republicans. And I think the senator is smart enough that he felt that ground shifting underneath of him and knew that he was going to be in for a very difficult race. So it crystallizes that Democrats already had a difficult path to maintain control of the Senate, and this just makes it a reality.
Okay, Jonathan, one more question on Manchin himself. Does, as he said in his statement, speaking out and mobilizing the middle, does that mean that we are seeing him possibly preparing a presidential run?
I think we're seeing him getting ready to go around the country and try to see if there's a group of people in the middle who want to be a more powerful voice. I think he believes that the fringes on in both parties actually are destructive to the center, which is where most of Americans are. And I think he's going to try to mobilize those people and see if there's an appetite for something bigger than just, you know, mobilizing them and having conversations.
Something bigger, maybe even the presidency. Let's see. Nathan, I want to ask you what you just said about what this means for Democrats in 2024. I mean, do they have any chance at this point of holding on to the Senate?
Well, they have a chance, but they basically have to run the table. I mean, if we look at it a different way, Republicans need a net gain of 2 seats to get control. Right now, they have a net gain of 1. So if each party just wins the seats that they have now, and Republicans win the White House, then Republicans would have control because the new vice president would break tie votes. Now, if President Biden wins re-election, Republicans need to get another Senate seat, but they have 6, 7 other opportunities to take over a seat that they don't already have, including 2 great opportunities in Ohio and Montana, where Trump is likely to win, even if he doesn't win the presidential race.
Do you agree with that?
I think the Democrats still have a strong shot of winning. Like, John Tester is a well-known entity in Montana. He will be the only Montanan on the ballot. That means something out there. For those of us who've watched Yellowstone, they don't take kindly to outsiders. And Sherrod Brown has won repeatedly in his state, much like Joe Manchin. I'd also point out Joe Manchin there was a recent poll put out by the NRSC that had Joe Manchin within a few points of Jim Justice. And had he run, I think he would have been a formidable opponent in the state. He's won a lot of races in and knows where every vote is personally.
I guess we won't find out now, but
we won't.
That's a good point. All right, so Nathan, I want to ask you about Republicans. Now that we've seen 3 Republican presidential debates and Donald Trump is still by far and away the leader of the field here, do you think we're going to start to see this field narrow even more?
It doesn't look like in the near future, particularly when I think you have both Governor Ron DeSantis and Ambassador Nikki Haley believing that they are the one that is in the strongest position to be that alternative to Trump. So as long as everyone believes that they have a path, then no one wants to cede ground to the other candidate. And it should be said that the presidential race is important to these Senate races and to our House races because there's a strong correlation between how voters vote at the top of the ticket and down ballot. For example, in 2020, only one state voted for one party for president and the other party for the Senate, and that was Maine, where they voted for Biden at the presidential level and Senator Susan Collins, the Republican. So what happens at the top of the ticket, it's a separate race for president, but it has a down ballot effect.
Yeah, well, I do want to ask you both about the polling numbers. I'll start with you, Jonathan, because we saw some polls that came out this week that looked pretty bad for the incumbent President Biden, showing Donald Trump leading, for example, in the New York Times Siena poll in 5 swing states. Do you think we're going to see a change in strategy among President Biden's team looking ahead to 2024?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I would suggest they do is start acting more like Donald Trump and tout all of his accomplishments. Donald Trump used to have a rally and a press conference and tons of tweets about nothing. Like no actual accomplishments. Joe Biden has had the most historic level of accomplishments of any first-term president.
But he can't seem to sell the economy. He's been doing
I think
that
he
over
needs
and over.
to get out there more and sell it and tout it more. I also would point out that, yes, the polls were bad in those states. It just so happens Democrats keep winning every election. So the polls might show one thing. It turns out Democratic policies are actually what voters like, not the Republican policies.
Democratic policies, maybe when Joe Biden's name is not on the ballot. What do you think, Nathan?
Well, I think even though Democrats had a great week in elections, I think it was in spite of Biden and not because of him. I think Biden is still in a weak position. And what Democrats, I think what Democrats need is they need this election to be a choice between Biden in a flawed alternative in Donald Trump or focused on Republicans. One of the reasons why Democrats did so well is because voters were focused on abortion access and focused on what Republicans either are doing, not doing, or want to do, particularly on abortion. But if voters are solely focused on, do you think President Biden is doing a good job or not? Right now, that type of election isn't going to go well for Democrats. But that's where Democrats are going to make the case, but also point out that the alternative, in their mind, is going to be worse than the status quo.
All right, 5 seconds each if I can ask you. Nathan, first, is this going to be a Trump-Biden matchup in a year's time?
Yes, I think so.
You agree, Jonathan? Yeah. All right. Well, that's the status quo. That's where we're going to head to. Thank you guys so much. Really interesting insights. Thanks for being on BBC News tonight.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on now. A New York jury has ordered Robert De Niro's production company to pay the actor's former personal assistant more than $1 million. The company was found guilty of engaging in gender discrimination and retaliation against Graham Chase Robinson. She and De Niro filed counter lawsuits after she quit his company in 2019. Robinson says the star underpaid her, made sexist comments, and assigned her stereotypically female tasks while she worked as an executive. De Niro testified in the trial that her allegations were all nonsense. He was not found personally liable in the civil trial. Actors are preparing to return to work in Hollywood after striking for nearly 4 months. Our North America correspondent David Willis reports from Los Angeles.
Relief tonight at the London premiere of the latest movie in the Hunger Games franchise. The ending of the longest actors' strike Hollywood has ever known. Good news for cast and crew on both sides of the Atlantic.
I'm just kind of grateful for the wider industry as a whole and my friends who can get back to work as well. And it also, it's, on a selfish level, it's nice to be able to do this and then hopefully move on to the next job, which is waiting in the wings.
A $1 billion deal giving actors here in Hollywood a greater share in the profits from streaming services and broader protection against the unfettered use of their likeness by AI, hailed as a major victory after 4 long months on the picket lines. A period of real-life Hunger Games for many in the entertainment industry.
It's been really challenging. We have a lot of our strike captains on the line that have been close to eviction and have had their only meal of the day be while they're striking.
It's such a feeling of joy and of triumph over adversity and not quitting.
It means work on some of the world's biggest box office franchises can now resume. Resolving this dispute had started to seem an impossible mission. With only a few months to go to the Hollywood Awards season, it will be action all over again quite soon. David Willis, BBC News, Los Angeles.
The father of Liverpool football player Luis Diaz has been released by a rebel group in Colombia. It comes nearly 2 weeks after his abduction sparked a huge manhunt. He was handed over to United Nations officials. The footballer's parents were kidnapped by the ELN rebel group as they were driving in the family's hometown, Barrancas, in northern Colombia. His mother was freed within hours, but his father was kept captive by the guerrilla group, who later described the kidnapping as a mistake. And New Zealand is holding its annual vote to elect its favorite bird to raise awareness of endangered native species. This year, this bird, the Puketeke, I hope I said that right, has found an unlikely backer in the U.S. chat show host John Oliver. The comedian has paid to erect billboards around the world in support of the bird, dubbing it Lord of the Wings, and his involvement has certainly ruffled a few feathers. Within 24 hours of this campaign launching, there were actually an extra 50,000 votes cast for this bird, as well as calls for the bird to be disqualified. All right, good luck to that bird. Thank you so much for watching BBC News. I'm Sumi Somaskanda here in Washington. Don't forget to check us out online as well, bbc.com/news. Stay with us.